right away when I saw these lockdowns and, you know, communities. I mean, I think we're starting to see, like even Italy, they sent a big, there was a big letter from the business community there saying, please stop this lockdown. We can't afford it. And, you know, here I am in Tokyo, you know, and so towards finding local truth, like, what does this really mean? I mean, we're all having this incredibly unprecedented shared experience and vulnerability. But what does that mean for the different communities? And how can we take the gift of this, that so it can unite our communities and unite us as human beings and really having more empathy. And so Jennifer and Ashok, I'd like to hear from each of you. Jennifer, from a public health strengthening standpoint, and, you know, like really would love to hear what indicators you're seeing. And if this would be a good segue into like what, you know, and I also wanted to, you know, kind of chime in on the AIDS in Africa experience that we both have witnessed in very different contexts. So I'd love to hear from you first on that with regards to equity, health equity, and you know, the different economies and yeah, how can people feed themselves?
The health workers right now are undergoing a lot of pressure, a lot of vulnerability because they are right at the front line. They are normally people who are in possession of power in terms of looking after their patients, but currently they feel very powerless. They are faced with death in amidst them and in front of them, losing patients from one time to another. So I have a very live example of a roommate of my daughter who is a nurse who recently had a serious depression and she was taken into hospital because of day in, day out being faced with the fear of death for herself, but also for her own patients. So that became so real that as we look out for well-being, we should actually be more alert about the health workers who are amidst our community. How are they coping with this loss? How are they coping with the vulnerability and the helplessness in front of their patients and being faced by these massive numbers of death and all that. I would say we have not yet reached that level in Uganda. We have very, very few cases currently, 54 at the moment. But we're also faced with the different vulnerabilities. When I look back at my engagement in the HIV and AIDS area, there was a lot of vulnerability, and as well when it comes to mental health of caregivers, whereby they were also very helpless looking after their dying relatives and friends. So what was very evident in those days was several cases of depression, both among the patients, but as well as among the caregivers. And this has been, has raised the number of mental health patients in our hospitals over time because of the various pandemics, and of course, not only just looking at the pandemic, but the impact of that pandemic, the number of orphans, the number of widows and widowers growing, and all this being faced by the economic diversity of not being able to fend for themselves and putting food on the table for the large and increasing numbers of family members. And maybe what I should mention that has come up very handy is the community system, the community values, whereby in our culture, it is the responsibility of the community of the village to bring up a child. It is the responsibility of everybody to look out for the well-being of a child in the community, as well as the well-being of a neighbor. So those kind of values system has been very handy in terms of really being resilient in the face of this epidemic. I'll add on more when it comes to share that, my experience with the different diseases.
My first time being in Southern Africa was in 2000. And what I remember was meeting with a female director of UN AIDS. And what she was saying was that all of the agencies needed to figure out a way of working together. And we could no longer focus just on the mission of our own agency, that it was like, no, this is about everyone. And if we don't figure out how to solve this shared concern, none of us can really move forward in a healthy, productive way. And that was, I think, yeah, that just, to me, that's a lesson of the AIDS pandemic that we can really look to for everything, not just for COVID. But if Jennifer, if you could say more about that, and actually would love to hear, because I don't think we got quite enough of an introduction from you, or I don't think we'll have time for it. But I mean, your experience is pretty deep with these issues. So if you could say a little more what comes to mind that could be useful from, you know, what the AIDS pandemic globally and, you know, through institutional collaboration has taught us, and Ebola, what's the difference between the two?
Right, Melanie, when it came to HIV and AIDS, I would start from the community. There was a call for community to come into action right from the grassroots, right from the community-based organizations, which were not in existence initially, but they were formed out of need, whereby a home with a person infected with HIV/AIDS would start grappling with what to do. And as they figure out what works and what does not work, they bring in a neighbor, they bring in the other neighbor, and by the time you realize they formed a community-based organization that's now helping the orphans around the village. You know, it's helping the widows around the village. The widows started coming together. You know, the people living with HIV/AIDS started forming organizations of people living with HIV/AIDS, and those then attracted the international community for funding, for technical assistance. You'll find some organizations, people leading organizations that have never, you know, even led a small village meeting, but because of the need, they rose up to it and, you know, started finding out what really works in those settings. Now, over and above that, the international community setting, we had, you know, different organizations coming together to form coalitions and looking at this as a multi-sectoral approach, not just as a health issue, as a health matter, but all the sectors at the national level came in. And, you know, time came when even every ministry in the government was asked to put aside, I remember in Uganda, it was 2% of their, you know, ministry budget, basically to respond to HIV/AIDS, you know, pandemic. And they were looking at different things. How do we intervene in terms of combating mental health, in terms of helping people to cope with nutrition, helping individuals within the organization also to live a more work-life balance, exercising. How do we share information? How do we create community awareness? And not only within the community, but within even work settings. That's the time when organizations started developing HIV and AIDS workplace policies, which really were responding to issues within their different organizational settings, because each organization had its own different ways of looking at how they were impacted on. And that eventually evolved into a well-being, you know, wellness policies, where they were saying, well, we are only now focusing on HIV and AIDS, but with HIV and AIDS, it is not a disease that presents itself in isolation. People who have diabetes and pressure and all these, once they are infected with HIV and AIDS, they tend to be, you know, more vulnerable. Therefore, let's look at the whole picture of well-being. And organizations like UNAIDS, like Global Fund, now came in to, you know, provide funding at a big scale, looking at issues of human rights. Because with HIV and AIDS, you know, there are many angles that it presents itself. A lot of human rights issues also came up. How do we look at the vulnerable societies? Matters we are all faced by you know, equal opportunities or chances of being infected. There are some vulnerable communities that are more you know, more at stake than others? How about the sex workers? How about, you know, people who use drugs, you know, injectable drugs and so on and so forth? So, and how are their rights being observed? What are their responsibilities? So we saw that there were lots of international organizations that came into play, different roles at different times, and that brought a whole question of the interlinkages and interdependence on one another to ensure the total well-being of a human being and total well-being of the community and the world at large, because there's a lot of, you know, that interdependence across communities, across nations, and all that. So there was a lot. There is still a lot, because we still have the pandemic with us, and we're still learning as we go along.
There are a great variety of medicinal plants that I think about 30% of the world's pharmaceuticals are made from the medicinal plants in the Amazon rainforest. And there's a lot more unexplored plant medicines to the Western medicine and the indigenous people know about. So in our center, we've had, in our old center, when we were in the lower Amazon rainforest, right now we are in the cloud forest, near the cloud forest of the Amazon. And when we were at the lower Amazon basin, at a certain point, because of deforestation, there was a malaria epidemic. And of course, all of these illnesses right now, also the scientists are starting to link also the COVID-19 as part of this degradation of our environment, and how this is a response from nature. People are hunting wildlife forms, and then this particular illness right now is the result of this kind of situation where people were just going into greater destruction of the environment. The eco balance on the planet is being offset. And then in the Amazonian tradition, the illnesses, they're sometimes seen as protectors of nature. So for example, the places where the malaria is more present are the places where there's a lot of deforestation, or a lot of mining going on, where they go into those ancient swamps that hold a lot of those disease agents, and then they are released as part of the protective mechanism of nature. So definitely this kind of connection is very essential between our inner and outer landscapes, and see how we can maintain a balance. In traditional Chinese medicine, I work with the Taoist 5-element system. Also, all of those elements that are outside of us are the elements that are inside of us, and then one is interdependent to another. There is an ancient Taoist saying that there is no external evil without an internal disbalance first. And then, of course, this illness that we are seeing coming to us from the outside, to me, it also seems as a direct result of our collective imbalance, and how we take care of the planet, how we take care of each other. And so this particular illness, the indigenous people refer to all of those illnesses that we are experiencing in terms of the physical health conditions. They refer to them as just expressions of the real illness, which is the sickness of humanity, which is the sickness that is based on confusion, ignorance, greed, anger, all kinds of just violence that is happening in the world. And then all of those other illnesses, they come as a result of that, because it then impacts the environment. In the Tibetan medicine also, it's considered that all the problems in the world, all the suffering in the world comes from the 3 poisons of the mind, which is the ignorance of not knowing the unconditional nature of the heart, and then the craving and aversion that come from that. Then from that go the 6 disturbing emotions, such as the pride, the envy, the attachment, the greed, the confusion, and the anger. And then those 6 disturbing emotions go into 84,000 combinations, creating any possible disease, problem, and issue in the world. But to me, and these ancient medicine traditions, they refer back to the energetics and how each organ is associated with a particular emotion. And if that emotion is not channeled in a healthy way, if there is no emotional intelligence in that respect, then this message will keep coming in to greater and greater extent, affecting the physical body.